In the dense, steaming jungles of the Pacific during World War II, United States Marines stumbled upon a machine the Japanese proudly called a tank, the Type 95 Heigo. To the Imperial Japanese Army, it was a symbol of speed and strength, a steel warrior for a new era of warfare. But to the battle-hardened Marines who faced it, it was something else entirely, something almost comical. When they first encountered these tanks and opened fire with their standard .50 caliber machine guns, the heavy rounds didn't just dent the armor, they punched straight through it. The Marines could hardly believe their eyes. Laughter echoed through their lines, not out of cruelty, but out of sheer, dumbfounded shock that something so fragile could be sent into the meat grinder of modern combat. This is the true story of the Japanese Heigo tank and how it became one of the most tragically outmatched fighting vehicles of the entire war. By 1942, the Pacific Ocean had become a sprawling battlefield, a theater of war stretching across thousands of miles of island chains and open water. Japan, riding a wave of early victories, had conquered vast territories from the heart of China to the shores of the Philippines. Their army was experienced, fiercely disciplined, and brimming with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. But when it came to armored warfare, Japan's strategy was built on a foundation of critical flaws. Their tank doctrine had been forged in the campaigns of the 1930s, primarily in China, where their main adversary was infantry equipped with little more than rifles and light machine guns. In that environment, speed was paramount. Armor was a secondary concern. Japan built tanks that could move quickly across difficult terrain, but they couldn't take a real punch. This strategic decision, born from past successes, would cost them dearly once they collided with the industrial might of the United States and the heavy firepower of its Marine Corps. The Pacific War would demand a different kind of strength, and Japan's armored forces were simply not prepared for it. The Type 95 Heigo was, by a wide margin, the most numerous Japanese tank of the war. But tank is a generous term. It weighed just over 7 tons, barely half the weight of the American M3 Stuart, which was itself considered a light tank. Its armor was paper-thin, a mere 12 millimeters at its thickest point. To put that in perspective, that was less than half an inch of steel protecting the crew from a storm of bullets and shrapnel. Its main armament was a 37-millimeter cannon, a weapon woefully inadequate for penetrating the armor of American tanks. It was crewed by only 3 men, a driver, a loader, and a commander who was tragically overworked, having to simultaneously command the tank, spot targets, and aim and fire the main gun. Inside, conditions were hellish. There was no radio for communication, no effective ventilation to clear out the stifling heat and cordite fumes, and virtually no real protection for the men crammed within its steel shell. On paper, the Heigo could reach a respectable speed of about 45 kilometers per hour on a flat road. But on the muddy, jungle-choked terrain of the Pacific Islands, it was slow, clumsy, and fragile. When the Marines captured their first intact Heigo, they were stunned. It looked more like a toy, a scaled-down model of a real tank, especially when parked next to the brawny Shermans and Stuarts they were accustomed to. Soon, they wouldn't have to guess about its weaknesses. They would see them demonstrated in the most brutal way possible. The Heigo's trial by fire against the Marines came during the pivotal Battle of Guadalcanal in August 1942. In a desperate bid to dislodge the Americans from their precarious beachhead, Japanese forces launched a fierce counterattack along the Tanaru River. Under the cover of darkness, a column of Heigo tanks rumbled toward the American perimeter, their engines clattering loudly as they rolled across the sandy terrain. The Marines heard them coming from a long way off. They dug in, took their positions, and waited with a tense, disciplined patience. When the first silhouette of a Heigo appeared, momentarily illuminated by muzzle flashes and the eerie glow of tracer fire, the Marines unleashed hell. They opened up with everything they had, including their Browning .50 caliber heavy machine guns. The results were immediate and devastating. The heavy 50 caliber rounds, designed to tear through light armor and aircraft, ripped through the Hago's thin plating with terrifying ease. Marines watched in astonishment as bullets entered the front armor and burst out the back in a shower of sparks and metal. Inside the steel coffins, the Japanese crews never stood a chance. By sunrise, the beach was a graveyard of burned-out, smoking wrecks. The Marines cautiously examined the destroyed tanks, and the grim reality set in. Their standard-issue machine guns had done all the work. No specialized anti-tank guns, no artillery strikes, just the raw, overwhelming firepower from their infantry support weapons. For the Marines on Guadalcanal, the scene was utterly unbelievable. They had all heard the fearsome tales of the German panzers rolling across Europe, tanks that could shrug off all but the heaviest Allied weapons. But here, in the Pacific, the so-called tanks of the Japanese Empire were barely more than armored trucks. One Marine later recalled that the 50 caliber rounds went in one side and out the other like punching holes in a tin can. Another famously joked that the armor was so thin you could probably peel it off with a can opener. A wave of grim laughter and relief spread through the Marine units. The psychological armor of the Japanese tank had been shattered. They realized they no longer had to fear these machines. In fact, seeing a Hago approach became a source of dark humor. Against the modern arsenal of American weapons, these tanks were not formidable weapons of war. They were mobile death traps for the brave but unfortunate crews inside them. The glaring weakness of the Hago wasn't an accident or a design flaw. It was a direct reflection of Japan's entire military philosophy. The Imperial Japanese Army was, at its core, an infantry-centric force. The soldier, with his bayonet and fighting spirit, was seen as the ultimate weapon. Tanks were viewed as secondary, a support weapon meant to help the infantry advance, break through light defenses, and suppress machine gun nests. They were not intended to engage in head-to-head combat with other tanks. In the vast plains of China, against an enemy with limited anti-tank capabilities, this doctrine had worked reasonably well. The Hago could use its speed to outmaneuver infantry, cross rivers on light bridges, and provide crucial fire support. But the Pacific War was a different beast. Facing well-equipped U.S. Marines armed with automatic weapons, bazookas, and overwhelming artillery support, the Hago's design was a recipe for disaster. To their credit, the Japanese did try to improve their tanks. Some frontline units desperately bolted extra steel plates to the hull or attempted to create spaced armor to deflect incoming rounds. But it was too little. Too late. The fundamental design was too weak. It changed very little. A 30 caliber round from a standard issue rifle could, at close range, still sometimes penetrate or damage its hull. Against the mighty Browning, 50 caliber, or the 37mm anti-tank guns mounted on American vehicles, the Hago might as well have been made of tin. The Hago's fragility was not an isolated problem. Japan's entire armored corps was fundamentally outdated by the time the war in the Pacific began in earnest. While Germany was churning out legendary Tigers and Panthers, and the Soviets were producing the revolutionary T-34, Japan's best tanks were still based on designs from the 1930s. Their heavier model, the Type 97 Chiha, was only roughly equivalent to America's early war light tanks and was hopelessly outclassed by the M4 Sherman. Part of the reason for this technological gap was geography and priorities. Japan's mountainous home islands and the dense jungles of their conquered territories were poorly suited for large, heavy tank operations. Furthermore, their industrial capacity and access to raw materials were limited. Within the Japanese military hierarchy, the Imperial Navy always received top priority for steel, resources, and funding, leaving the Army and its tank development programs to fend for themselves with the leftovers. By 1944, Japanese tanks had become more of a liability than a weapon. The joke among Marines that the armor was just good enough to keep the rain out was depressingly close to the truth. When American military engineers captured intact Hagos and shipped them back to the Aberdeen Proving Ground for testing, their findings confirmed everything the Marines had witnessed in combat. A single .50 caliber armor-piercing round, fired from 300 yards, could cleanly penetrate the tank's thickest frontal armor. Despite its catastrophic flaws, the Type 95 Hago soldiered on, fighting with desperate courage until the final bloody months of the war. It saw action in the Philippines, on the fortified island of Iwo Jima, and during the apocalyptic battle for Okinawa. By then, however, it was completely and utterly outmatched. In a last-ditch effort to make them useful, Japanese crews often resorted to desperate tactics. Some buried their tanks in the ground up to the turret, turning them into static, camouflaged bunkers. Others, driven by a code of honor that forbade surrender, launched suicidal banzai charges against American Sherman tanks, knowing full well they had no chance of even scratching the enemy's paint before being blown to pieces. When Japan finally surrendered in August 1945, hundreds of abandoned Hago tanks were found rusting away in remote jungles and swamps across the Pacific, silent, corroding monuments to how far behind Japan's armored forces had fallen. The Type 95 Hago was a tank designed for a different kind of war, a relic of an era when mobility was valued above all else. But once it collided with the brutal reality of American industrial firepower, its weaknesses became impossible to ignore. Its paper-thin armor, its weak main gun, and its outdated tactical doctrine made it one of the most vulnerable tanks ever to see major combat. When those Marines laughed as their .50 caliber bullets sailed straight through its hull, it wasn't a mockery born of cruelty. It was a laugh of pure, unadulterated disbelief that such a machine could ever be considered a viable weapon of war. The Hago became a tragic symbol of the vast, unbridgeable gap between Japan's imperial ambitions and its technological reality. In the unforgiving crucible of the Pacific, evolution decided who survived, and the Hago, for all the bravery of its crews, never stood a chance. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this story interesting, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more dives into military history. We'll see you in the next one.